My name is Samantha Weiss, and I am going to be describing the early life and exploits of Thomas Edward Lawrence, more commonly known as T.E. Lawrence or Lawrence of Arabia. My partner Aidan will continue from the year 1919 onward. Thomas Edward Lawrence was a British archaeological scholar, a military strategist, and an author who was best known for his incredible war exploits in the Middle East during the Great War. He is also known for having written an account of those exploits in his 1926 memoir, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. This memoir has been criticized for being biased toward himself, with Lawrence presenting himself as both victim and hero in a self-serving account that many consider somewhat mythical. Lawrence seemed to be more focused on writing a dramatic epic than a completely accurate account of his experiences, but no amount of myth can quench the popularity his book gained and the belief in his exploits and greatness. Regardless of his apparent self-love, he was in fact an incredible figure from whom we can learn many things, many of which I and Aidan will explore in this synthesis. Rumor has it that T.E. Lawrence is now held as a prime example for American military officers working in the Muslim world. He impressed many important figures of the 20th century, such as Winston Churchill, Bernard Shaw, and King George V, because of his courage, tenacity, and ability to push himself far past his limit, both physically and mentally, to accomplish what he needed to get done. T.E. Lawrence was born in Tremadog, formerly Tremadog, North Wales, in 1888. He was born to Sir Thomas Chapman and Sarah Maiden. Sarah Maiden was actually the governess for Sir Thomas's daughters, and he had escaped with her from his marriage and from Ireland. Thomas Edward was the second of the couple's 5 sons, and in 1896, his family moved to Oxford. T.E., which was what he preferred to be called over Thomas Edward, attended the high school and Jesus College in Oxford. Here he wanted to study history, though he was required to take prerequisites, either law or classical literature, beforehand, and chose to study law before being able to focus on modern history. His first interest was medieval military architecture, and he was able to pursue that interest in its actual historical context. For example, he studied Crusader castles in France, Syria, and Palestine, and submitted a thesis on the topic that got him first-class honors in history in 1910. It was unfortunately not published until 1936 after T.E. had died. He was a protege of the archaeologist D.G. Hogarth and was able to join an expedition excavating the Hittite settlement on the Euphrates, working there from 1911 until 1914. He used his free time to travel alone, getting to know the language and the people. The month that the Great War began, Lawrence got hired as a civilian employee at the map department of the War Office in London. He was told to prepare a detailed map of Sinai that could be used for military strategy. By December of 1914, he was a lieutenant in Cairo due to his intelligence and knowledge of the Middle East. Experts on Arab affairs were rare, especially ones who had actually traveled through the Turkish-held Arab lands. Therefore, Lawrence was assigned to intelligence, and he spent over a year there. During this year, he mostly interviewed prisoners, drew maps for military use, processed data given to him from agents behind enemy lines, and wrote a handbook on the Turkish army. In mid-1915, 2 of Lawrence's brothers, Will and Frank, were unfortunately killed in action in France. This was a cruel reminder to Lawrence of the more active front in the West. During this time, Egypt was the staging area for Middle Eastern military operations of horrible inefficiency, and a trip to Arabia convinced Lawrence that there was an alternative method of undermining Germany's Turkish ally. In October of 1916, T.E. had accompanied the diplomat Sir Ronald Storrs on a mission to Arabia, where the emir, or the Islamic commander-in-chief at the time, had just recently announced a revolt against the Turks that previous June. Lawrence and Storrs consulted with the emir's son, Abdullah, and Lawrence was given permission to consult with another of his sons, Faisal, who was then commanding an Arab force southwest of Medina. The purpose of this trip to Arabia was to work secretly as a liaison officer to help organize the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. His role was to access the revolt's progress, act as an advisor to the emir's sons, and plan their next actions with British military strategy. Back in Cairo in November, Lawrence urged his superiors to aid the rebellion efforts with weapons and gold, and to utilize the current dissident sheikhs, which is an Arabic title that refers to a wise or respected man, often a tribal chief, a religious leader, or a spiritual guide in Islam, by meshing their desire for independence with military strategy. He rejoined Faisal's army as a political and liaison officer. While Lawrence was not the only officer to become involved in the Arab uprising, he quickly became its brains, organizing force, and military technician. His small but annoying second front behind the Turkish lines was a hit-and-run guerrilla operation that focused on the mining of bridges and supply chain trains, as well as the appearance of Arab forces from place to place, trapping enemy forces that otherwise would have deployed elsewhere, and making sure the Damascus to Medina railway was inoperable for enemy use. The goal was to render Turkish forces helpless to crush the uprising. Lawrence, who had been given the name Emir Dynamite by his admirers, bribed the sheikhs with promises of enemy booty and English gold, as well as a kingmaker's vision of an Arab nation. The first major victory for the Arab guerrilla forces was Aqaba at the northern tip of the Red Sea, which they seized after a 2-month march on July 6, 1917. Lawrence afterwards attempted to coordinate Arab movements with General Sir Edmund Allenby's campaign, which was moving toward Jerusalem. This tactic was only partly successful. In November 1917, Lawrence was captured at Daraa by the Turks while dressed in Arab clothing, and was apparently recognized, then homosexually assaulted before being able to escape. Although some biographers challenge the canonical story and sometimes try to distort it, Lawrence himself, in his memoir, described the experience as having left both physical scars and wounds on his psyche from which he never recovered. Nevertheless, the next month, Lawrence took part in the victory parade in Jerusalem and then returned to increasingly successful actions in which Faisal's forces kept moving toward the north. Lawrence rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel with the Distinguished Service Order, or the DSO. The Arab army reached Damascus in October of 1918. At this point, T.E. was physically and emotionally exhausted. He had been forcing his body and his mind to the breaking point too much. He had been wounded multiple times, captured and tortured. He had endured extreme hunger, weather, and sickness. He had been driven by the military to commit awful acts against the enemy. In the chaos of Damascus, he witnessed the defeat of his aspirations for an Arab nation right at the moment of their triumph. They became unable to look forward to a new nation due to their apparently incurable factionalism. In the wake of this, Lawrence left to go home, disillusioned, right before the armistice. In front of a royal audience on October 30th, 1918, Lawrence politely refused the Order of the Bath, which is the fourth most senior of the British Orders of Chivalry, which recognizes achievements done by senior military officers, and the DSO. This left King George V in shock, and, as he said, holding the box in my hand. Lawrence was demobilized as a lieutenant colonel on July 31st, 1919. He became a private at the age of 34 after having been a lieutenant at 30. In between these positions, he fought in vain for Arab independence at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. He even showed up wearing Arab robes for the occasion. He also fought in vain against the separation of Syria and Lebanon from the rest of the Arab countries as a French mandate. Meanwhile, he was also working on his memoir, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which I mentioned at the beginning. My partner Aidan will continue from here.
Now, jumping into 1919, T.E. Lawrence, already known as Lawrence of Arabia for some of us, he stepped into a new role, which was diplomatic. He had helped lead the Arab Revolt during World War I. He had a key role in it, and he joined Emir Faisal at the Paris Peace Conference, and he was hoping going in to secure Arab independence. He had promised Arab leaders their freedom, and part of the deal was that it would be given. But that was not the case, and he realized he had been completely undermined through this entire process. The British and French, behind his back, had already agreed to divide the Middle East under the secret Sykes-Picot agreements. Now, Laurent had promised these Arab leaders their freedom, and that clearly would not come to play now. And he found himself basically, some would call him a pawn in the midst of this imperial political scheme or process. And the betrayal of these people really hurt him on an emotional, spiritual, a huge impact. And we can see that directly through his book, the known as 7 Pillars of Wisdom. So he was pretty much shattered from this entire process. He lost his identity in some sense. He turned to writing as a form of therapy for his testimony. And he began to compose that 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And it's a realistic account of the Arab Revolt. But he lost copies. He lost, actually, ironically, his first copy he lost at a train station in 1919. But undeterred, he rewrote the entire book from memory over the next year. And that's how you know he really meant what he was writing. The result was more than just a account of war. It was a philosophical account on loyalty, betrayal, and his identity throughout the entire process. There was also a shorter version made in 1927 called Revolt in the Desert, which was released to the public because originally his 7 Pillars of Wisdom was not. It was privately owned. The book cemented his literary reputation, and it revealed the emotional trauma that it caused him back in his wartime experiences. Now, if we look back into some of his personal life and inner turmoil, he never was married, and he kept his personal life intensely private. He did not like people butting in on his business or seeing what he was feeling, other than through his writings, which he really didn't release until later on. He had a few very close friends, both men and women, and but he seemed to fear intimacy in a real relationship, such as attending to a spouse or like that. What's clear, though, is that he suffered from severe depression and possibly PTSD based off the Arab Revolt and the time he served in the military there. He often described himself, throughout some of his writings as well, as broken by war. His retreat into military life wasn't just about avoiding people, because he was such an introvert. It was about healing himself, or at least hiding from the psychological aspects of what he was carrying around. So if we keep going here, if we go into his literary and cultural legacy, despite his efforts to disappear, Laurent remained a cultural icon for many people. That's hence why we're making this video right now. Writers like George Bernard Shaw and politicians, even including Winston Churchill, admired him. Churchill even offered him a ranking in the government, which was considered very high, which Laurent declined because he wanted to avoid that public appearance. His book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, was praised and renowned by many, many people. It offered a very diverse look at the ideas of war and the cost of idealism through war and through his experience. It's not about heroism, it's about the harsh realities of war and empire and what it entails. And it's an interesting read. If we look too at 1922 to 1935, Laurent despised the fame that followed him. I believe I previously stated, a man whose myth had eclipsed the truth. Laurent had this reputation that surrounded him that he was some sort of incredible war hero, and he was trying to prove the point that it was a harsh reality and it was not, in fact, the truth. But by 1922, he enlisted in the Royal Air Force under the alias of John Hume Ross to escape public attention. He went to the absolute extremes of changing his name. He refused honors. He avoided interviews, and he sought peace and being away from people. So he kind of escaped in the chaos of military life. His letters from this period revealed that he was a man seeking peace through disciplined routine and just different ways of being out there without being watched entirely by the public. And then if we look here, I put as well, when it comes to the end here, in February 1935, he retired from the RAF, and he moved to his cottage in Clouds Hill in Dorset. Just 2 months later, on May 13th, he tragically crashed his motorcycle while swerving to avoid 2 boys on bicycles, and he died 6 days later from the head injuries at the age of 46, a young death. His funeral, though, was attended by military officers, politicians, writers. It was a very renowned funeral. Even in his death, though, he remained an icon. He was part soldier, part scholar, writer, and myth, in a sense. But he became a legend, and he secured himself in that. His post-1919 life was a journey, instead of outward, I would say more inward, because he turned away from power and prestige and reputation, and instead wanted to live a life of reflecting, peace, service, and solitude. His legacy is, I would say, very complex, because it's kind of a mixture of multiple wanting to be known, and then that switch after 1919 and the peace accords. But he was brilliant. He was a brilliant strategist. We'll give him that. An amazing writer, and he was deeply convicted, and it is unfortunately that he might not have known Jesus, based off of some of his writings. But the 7 Pillars of Wisdom remains one of the most profound war memoir ever written to this date. And Lawrence himself remains a symbol of the turmoil between a myth and the harsh realities of what's actually happening, and between how could I put this, between public duty and the public eye, and how you consciously feel about the situation you're in. And Lawrence is a key proponent of those kinds of things. And he lived an incredible life. He suffered very much, but he also taught a lot of people through what happened. And that wraps up our presentation on Lawrence. Thank you.